Sarah Martinez had always been the type of person who blended into the background. At 22, she possessed an unremarkable appearance that made her nearly invisible in crowds. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were practical rather than fashionable. When she enlisted in the Army, nobody expected much from the soft-spoken girl from a small farming town in Nebraska. The deployment to Afghanistan came faster than anyone anticipated. Sarah found herself assigned to Forward Operating Base Zulu, a dusty outpost surrounded by mountains and constant tension. The base housed about 200 soldiers, mostly infantry and support personnel. Sarah was assigned to the communications tent, where she spent her days maintaining radio equipment and handling message traffic between units. Her tent mates barely acknowledged her existence. Corporal Jake Morrison, a loud-mouthed soldier from Texas, dominated most conversations with stories of his supposed combat heroics. Sergeant Lisa Chen, a tough logistics specialist, usually had her nose buried in supply reports. Private Danny Rodriguez, the youngest of the group, spent his free time writing letters home to his girlfriend. Sarah simply went about her duties quietly, never drawing attention to herself. What none of them knew was that Sarah carried a secret that could save lives. Before enlisting, she had completed 2 years of pre-med studies at the University of Nebraska. More importantly, her father was a paramedic, and she had spent countless hours riding along with him during emergency calls. She knew how to treat trauma wounds, perform CPR, and handle medical emergencies better than most trained combat medics. But Sarah never mentioned this to anyone. She had joined the Army to pay for college, not to be a hero. The communications job felt safe, tucked away from the front lines where the real fighting happened. She preferred it that way, maintaining the radios and staying out of trouble. The base had 2 official medics, Doc Williams, a seasoned veteran with 15 years of experience, and Specialist Murphy, a recent graduate from medical training. They handled routine sick calls and minor injuries with professional efficiency. Sarah watched them work sometimes, mentally noting their techniques and occasionally spotting procedures she would have done differently based on her father's teachings. Life at the Forward Operating Base followed a predictable routine. Wake up at 500 hours, morning physical training, chow, work details, more chow, evening activities, and lights out. The days blended together in a haze of desert heat and monotony. Rocket attacks were occasional but brief, sending everyone scrambling to bunkers before the all-clear sounded minutes later. Sarah's section chief, Staff Sergeant Williams, appreciated her quiet competence. She never caused problems, always completed her assignments on time, and possessed an unusual talent for troubleshooting communication equipment. When radios failed in the field, Sarah could often talk units through repairs over the radio, earning her a reputation as someone who knew her job well. The other soldiers began calling her Mouse because she moved so quietly around the base. Sarah didn't mind the nickname. It reinforced her preferred status as someone who stayed in the background, unnoticed and unremarkable. She wrote letters to her parents twice a week, describing the routine aspects of deployment while carefully avoiding anything that might worry them. Her father's letters always included questions about whether she was using the medical knowledge he had taught her. Sarah's responses were deliberately vague. She assured him that everyone stayed healthy, and that the base medics handled any medical issues that arose. She never mentioned that she sometimes lay awake at night, wondering if her skills might be needed someday. The communications tent sat near the center of the base, surrounded by sandbags and camouflage netting. Sarah's workspace consisted of multiple radio systems, satellite communication equipment, and banks of computers that maintained contact with higher headquarters. She had decorated her small area with a single photograph of her family's farm and a small American flag her mother had sewn for her. During quiet periods, Sarah would listen to radio chatter from patrol units operating outside the base. She learned to recognize voices and call signs, developing a mental picture of operations happening beyond the protective walls. Sometimes the radio traffic included requests for medical evacuation, and Sarah would feel her heart rate increase as she imagined the wounded soldiers waiting for help. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, was a stern but fair officer who made regular rounds to check on his soldiers. He had spoken to Sarah only a few times, usually brief exchanges about communication capabilities or equipment status. She doubted he even knew her name, which suited her perfectly. As weeks turned into months, Sarah settled into the rhythm of deployment life. She attended mandatory training sessions, participated in physical fitness activities, and maintained her equipment with quiet professionalism. Her tent mates had grown accustomed to her presence without really getting to know her. She was simply part of the background, reliable but unremarkable. The base's medical facility was located in a hardened building near the landing zone, where helicopters brought in supplies and casualties from other locations. Sarah had walked past it countless times but never had reason to enter. The medics worked in their own world, dealing with challenges she could only imagine. Sarah's most significant interaction with the medical staff occurred when she developed a minor ear infection from the constant use of radio headsets. Doc Williams examined her briefly, prescribed some antibiotics, and sent her back to duty. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 minutes, and Sarah was struck by how rushed and overworked the medical team appeared. That night, as she lay in her narrow cot listening to the distant sound of generators and radio static, Sarah wondered if she was wasting her medical knowledge. Her father had invested years teaching her emergency procedures, and she possessed skills that might help save lives. But revealing those abilities would change everything about her quiet, safe existence at the base. She pushed those thoughts aside and focused on her upcoming rotation home. In 6 months, she would complete her deployment and return to Nebraska to finish her degree. The Army would pay for her education, and she could become a doctor like she had always planned. Her time as an anonymous communications specialist would become just a chapter in her larger story. Sarah had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would shatter her carefully maintained anonymity and thrust her into a situation where her hidden skills would mean the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. The morning of September 15th started like any other day at Forward Operating Base Zulu. Sarah completed her equipment checks, responded to routine radio traffic, and settled into the familiar rhythm of communication duties. The temperature was already climbing toward another scorching afternoon, and dust particles danced in the shafts of sunlight filtering through the tent walls. Around 1100 hours, the routine was shattered by an urgent radio transmission from Patrol Base Echo, a smaller outpost 12 miles north of their location. The voice crackling through the speakers belonged to Lieutenant Davies, and Sarah could hear the tension in his transmission. Zulu Base, this is Echo 6. We have received intelligence indicating a possible Taliban gathering approximately 2 kilometers from our position. Request permission to investigate and disrupt. Sarah dutifully logged the transmission and forwarded it to the operations center. Within minutes, Colonel Harrison's voice came over the command frequency, authorizing a reconnaissance mission with rules of engagement to engage if threatened. Sarah listened as the patrol prepared to move out, conducting radio checks and coordinating with supporting elements. The mission seemed routine at first. Echo Patrol reported movement to their objective, established overwatch positions, and began surveillance of the suspected meeting location. Sarah monitored their progress while handling other communication traffic. But something about the situation felt different. The radio chatter contained an undercurrent of tension that experienced soldiers develop when sensing danger. At 14:30 hours, everything changed in an instant. The peaceful afternoon exploded into chaos as Echo Patrol's radio erupted with desperate transmissions. The Taliban had been waiting in ambush, and the American soldiers found themselves surrounded and under heavy fire from multiple directions. Contact. Contact, we are taking heavy fire from the north and east. Multiple casualties. Lieutenant Davies' voice cut through static and gunfire. Sarah's hands moved automatically across her equipment, ensuring clear communication channels while her heart pounded against her ribs. The base immediately launched into emergency response procedures. Colonel Harrison coordinated with higher headquarters for air support, while the Quick Reaction Force prepared to deploy. Sarah found herself at the center of a communication hurricane, relaying messages between multiple units, aircraft, and command elements. But the news from Echo Patrol continued to worsen. Their medic, Corporal Peterson, had been hit in the initial moments of the ambush. 2 other soldiers were critically wounded, and the patrol was pinned down in a drainage ditch with limited cover. Medical evacuation helicopters were available, but the landing zone remained under enemy fire. Zulu Base, Echo 6, Lieutenant Davies transmitted, his voice strained with stress and exhaustion. Peterson is unconscious. We have Rodriguez with a sucking chest wound and Williams with severe bleeding from his leg. I need medical guidance immediately. Sarah felt her blood turn cold as she listened to the desperate transmission. She knew that without immediate medical attention, those soldiers would likely die before evacuation became possible. The quick reaction force was still 20 minutes away, and the medical evacuation helicopter couldn't land under enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Williams, her section chief, was coordinating with the operations center when he noticed Sarah's pale expression. "Martinez, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah nodded quickly, not trusting her voice to remain steady, but inside her mind a fierce battle was raging. She possessed the knowledge to guide Lieutenant Davies through life-saving procedures over the radio. Her father had taught her how to treat sucking chest wounds and control massive bleeding. She knew emergency medicine better than most trained combat medics, but revealing that knowledge would expose her secret and potentially put her in situations she wasn't prepared to handle. She had deliberately chosen a support role to avoid exactly this type of responsibility. The safety of her anonymous position suddenly felt more important than ever. Another transmission from Echo Patrol shattered her internal debate. "Zulu Base, Rodriguez is getting worse. His breathing is becoming labored and Williams has lost consciousness. I don't know what to do." Sarah watched helplessly as the radio operators tried to reach Doc Williams, but he was with the quick reaction force, already en route to the contact site. Specialist Murphy was dealing with a separate medical emergency at another location on the base. No qualified medical personnel were available to provide guidance. The seconds stretched into minutes as Sarah listened to the deteriorating situation. She could hear the desperation in Lieutenant Davies's voice as he tried to help his wounded soldiers with limited medical knowledge. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to speak up, to provide the guidance that could save lives. But fear held her back. Fear of responsibility, fear of failure, fear of changing her carefully constructed identity as someone who stayed safely in the background. She had spent months building her reputation as a quiet, competent communications specialist. Speaking up now would destroy that anonymity forever. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through her internal struggle as he entered the communications tent. "Do we have anyone with medical training who can provide guidance to Echo Patrol?" Staff Sergeant Williams shook his head grimly. "Both our medics are unavailable, sir. Echo Patrol is on their own until the QRF arrives." Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. 2 soldiers were dying while she sat in relative safety, possessing knowledge that could save them. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that medical knowledge carried moral obligations. "If you can help someone and choose not to," he had always said, "you become partly responsible for the consequences." The radio crackled again, with Lieutenant Davies's increasingly desperate voice. "Zulu Base, I think Rodriguez has stopped breathing. I need help immediately." That transmission shattered Sarah's resolve. Without conscious thought, she reached for the radio handset, her training and moral compass overriding her fears. But as her hand touched the device, Staff Sergeant Williams noticed her movement. "Martinez, what are you doing?" he asked sharply. Sarah found herself frozen between 2 choices that would define not only her deployment, but potentially the rest of her military career. She could maintain her safe anonymity and hope that help would arrive in time, or she could reveal her hidden knowledge and accept the responsibility that came with it. The radio continued broadcasting the sounds of gunfire and desperate voices as Echo Patrol fought for survival in the Afghan mountains. Time was running out for the wounded soldiers, and Sarah realized that her next decision would determine whether they lived or died. Her hand tightened on the radio handset as she made the choice that would change everything. Sarah keyed the radio handset, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Echo 6, this is Zulu Base. I can provide medical guidance. What is Rodriguez's current condition?" Staff Sergeant Williams stared at her in shock, but Colonel Harrison, who had been listening to the exchange, stepped closer to the radio. Lieutenant Davies's response came immediately, filled with desperate relief. "Thank God. Rodriguez appears unconscious, very pale, and I can barely detect breathing. There's blood around his mouth, and his chest wound is making bubbling sounds." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, visualizing the scene based on her father's training. "Echo 6, Rodriguez has a pneumothorax. His lung has collapsed. You need to seal that chest wound immediately. Do you have any plastic wrapping tape or a pressure bandage?" "I have a field dressing and some tape," Lieutenant Davies replied. his voice focused now that he had guidance. Good. Take the plastic wrapper from the field dressing and tape it over the wound on 3 sides only, leaving one side open. This creates a flutter valve that will allow air to escape but not enter the chest cavity. As Sarah provided step-by-step instructions, she became aware that other personnel had gathered in the communications tent. Word was spreading quickly that the quiet communications specialist somehow possessed advanced medical knowledge. But she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing entirely on saving lives. The bleeding from William's leg. Describe what you see, Sarah continued, her voice gaining confidence as her training took over. There's a lot of blood and it's spurting with each heartbeat. I tried to put pressure on it, but the bleeding won't stop. Sarah's stomach clenched. Arterial bleeding in a leg wound often meant damage to the femoral artery, which could be fatal within minutes. Echo 6, you're dealing with arterial bleeding. You need to apply a tourniquet above the wound immediately. Do you have a cat tourniquet? Yes, but I've never used one before. Sarah guided Lieutenant Davies through the proper application of the tourniquet, explaining how to position it high on the thigh and tighten it until the bleeding stopped completely. She could hear him working in the background while gunfire continued to echo through the radio transmission. The bleeding has stopped, Davies reported, relief evident in his voice. But Williams is still unconscious. That's normal from blood loss. Keep him warm and monitor his breathing. How is Rodriguez doing now? His breathing seems better and some color is returning to his face. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction, but she knew the soldiers weren't out of danger yet. The quick reaction force was still 15 minutes away, and medical evacuation remained impossible while the landing zone was under fire. She needed to keep both wounded soldiers stable until professional help arrived. Colonel Harrison had been listening intently to the entire exchange. During a brief lull in transmission, he stepped closer to Sarah. Martinez, where did you learn this? My father is a paramedic, sir. I completed 2 years of pre-med before enlisting. Sarah kept her eyes focused on the radio, not wanting to see the expressions of surprise on the faces around her. Why didn't you mention this during in-processing? I enlisted for communication, sir. I never intended to use medical skills. The radio crackled again with another urgent transmission from Echo Patrol. Zulu Base, we have another problem. Peterson, our medic, is regaining consciousness, but he's complaining of severe head pain and seems confused. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Head trauma combined with loss of consciousness suggested a serious brain injury. Echo 6, Peterson likely has a concussion or worse. Keep him still and don't let him fall asleep. Monitor his pupils if possible. Are they the same size? Negative, his left pupil is larger than his right. Sarah felt her heart sink. Unequal pupils after head trauma indicated increased pressure inside the skull, a potentially fatal condition. There was nothing Lieutenant Davies could do in the field to treat that injury, but keeping Peterson conscious and monitoring his condition would provide valuable information for the doctors who would eventually treat him. As she continued providing medical guidance, Sarah became aware of the profound change happening around her. The other soldiers in the tent looked at her with new respect and curiosity. Staff Sergeant Williams had stopped questioning her actions and was actively supporting her efforts by coordinating with other units. Most significantly, Colonel Harrison had remained in the communications tent throughout the entire emergency, listening to every word she spoke. Sarah realized that her carefully maintained anonymity had been shattered completely. By the time this crisis ended, everyone on the base would know about her medical knowledge. The radio brought more updates from Echo Patrol. The quick reaction force had finally arrived and was engaging the Taliban fighters. The sound of additional gunfire filled the transmission, but Lieutenant Davies reported that the immediate area around the wounded soldiers was now secure. Zulu Base. The QRF is here, and they have a medic with them. Doc Williams wants to know if the person providing guidance can brief him on what treatments have been performed. Sarah looked at Colonel Harrison, who nodded encouragingly. She keyed the handset again. Doc Williams, this is Martinez in the comm center. Rodriguez had a pneumothorax that has been treated with an improvised flutter valve. Williams had arterial bleeding controlled with a high tourniquet applied approximately 20 minutes ago. Peterson has head trauma with unequal pupils and altered mental status. Doc Williams' voice came through the radio, professional and grateful. Outstanding work, Martinez. These treatments have definitely saved lives. We'll take over from here and prepare them for medical evacuation. As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah felt the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had saved lives, but she had also destroyed the quiet, anonymous existence she had worked so hard to maintain. There would be questions, evaluations, and possibly assignment changes that she wasn't prepared for. Colonel Harrison placed a hand on her shoulder. "Martinez, I want to see you in my office as soon as this situation is resolved. We need to discuss your background and potential reassignment." Sarah nodded, knowing that her deployment had just taken a dramatic turn. The communications tent that had been her safe haven now felt different, filled with curious stares and whispered conversations about the quiet girl who had suddenly revealed herself to be much more than anyone had suspected. Outside, the sound of helicopters approaching signaled the arrival of medical evacuation aircraft. Soon, the wounded soldiers would be on their way to advance medical care, alive because a quiet communications specialist had found the courage to reveal her hidden talents when lives hung in the balance. 2 hours after the medical evacuation, helicopters disappeared into the Afghan sky. Sarah found herself sitting in Colonel Harrison's office, still wearing her dusty uniform and feeling the weight of everyone's stares as she had walked across the base. Word had spread quickly about the communications specialist who had talked Lieutenant Davies through life-saving medical procedures. The colonel's office was spartanly decorated with military maps, unit awards, and a single photograph of his family. Colonel Harrison sat behind his metal desk, reviewing Sarah's personnel file with an expression she couldn't read. The silence stretched uncomfortably before he finally looked up. "Martinez, I've been reviewing your records and I have some questions. Your education background shows pre-med coursework, but there's no mention of any medical training or certifications. How extensive is your medical knowledge?" Sarah shifted in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, my father has been a paramedic for 20 years. I rode along with him regularly from age 16 until I enlisted. I completed EMT training in high school and helped with emergency calls in our rural area. The pre-med coursework covered anatomy, physiology, and basic medical procedures. Yet you never mentioned any of this during your initial military occupational specialty selection." "Why?" "I wanted a support role, sir. I joined the Army to pay for college, not to be in situations where lives depend on my decisions." Sarah's voice was quiet but steady. "I thought communications would be safer." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her intently. "Safer for whom? You or the soldiers who might need medical care when qualified medics aren't available?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been so focused on protecting herself from responsibility that she hadn't considered how her silence might affect others. "I never thought about it that way, sir." "Well, you should have." The colonel's tone was firm but not harsh. "Every soldier in this unit has skills and knowledge that could benefit the mission and save lives. By hiding your medical background, you've been withholding a valuable resource from your fellow soldiers." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "You're right, sir. I was selfish, perhaps, but what matters now is what we do moving forward." Colonel Harrison closed her file and leaned forward. "Doc Williams is recommending that you be considered for immediate reassignment to medical duties. He believes your knowledge and performance today demonstrate that you could be more valuable in a medical role." The suggestion sent a chill through Sarah's chest. "Sir, I'm not qualified to be a combat medic. I don't have the formal training or certification. No, but you have knowledge and instincts that can't be taught in any school. Doc Williams is willing to provide additional training to bring you up to standard on military-specific procedures. The question is whether you're willing to accept that responsibility." Sarah stared at the floor, her mind racing. Everything she had worked to avoid was being offered to her directly. The safe, anonymous role she had carefully constructed was disappearing, replaced by the kind of life-or-death responsibility she had feared since arriving in Afghanistan. "I need time to think about it, sir. You have until tomorrow morning." "But Martinez," Colonel Harrison's voice softened slightly, "what you did today saved 2 lives. Rodriguez and Williams are both stable and expected to make full recoveries. Lieutenant Davies told me that without your guidance, both soldiers would have died before help arrived." After being dismissed, Sarah walked slowly back to her tent, acutely aware of the changed atmosphere around her. Soldiers who had never spoken to her before nodded respectfully as she passed. Some even stopped to thank her for saving their fellow soldiers. The anonymity she had cherished was completely gone. Her tent mates were waiting when she arrived. Corporal Morrison, usually so full of bravado, seemed almost shy as he approached her. "Martinez, I had no idea you knew all that medical stuff. That was incredible what you did today." Sergeant Chen looked up from her reports with new respect in her eyes. "Doc Williams came by looking for you. He wants to talk about training opportunities. Said you have natural instincts that can't be taught." Private Rodriguez, no relation to the wounded soldier, was the most direct. "Why didn't you ever tell us you were basically a doctor? We've been treating you like just another comm specialist." Sarah sat heavily on her cot, feeling the weight of their attention. "Because I didn't want to be anything else. I just wanted to do my job and go home." "But you could have been helping people all along," Morrison said, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why would you hide something like that?" "Because helping people means being responsible when they get hurt or die. I wasn't ready for that kind of pressure." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought if I stayed quiet, I could avoid having to make life or death decisions." Sergeant Chen closed her laptop and gave Sarah her full attention. "But you made those decisions today anyway, and you saved 2 guys who would have died otherwise. Yeah, and now everyone expects me to do it again. What if next time I make the wrong call? What if someone dies because I'm not good enough?" The tent fell silent as her tent mates absorbed the weight of her fears. Finally, Morrison spoke up, his usual joking tone replaced by sincerity. "Martinez, nobody expects you to be perfect, but you've got skills that could help people. Seems wrong to waste them because you're scared." That evening, Sarah lay on her cot staring at the tent ceiling, unable to sleep. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. She kept hearing Lieutenant Davies' desperate voice, feeling the pressure of those critical moments when soldiers' lives hung in the balance. Her father's letters were stored in a small box beside her cot. She pulled out the most recent one and reread his familiar handwriting. As always, he had asked about whether she was using her medical knowledge to help others. For months she had deflected those questions with vague responses. Now she realized that her father would be proud of what she had done today, but disappointed that it had taken a crisis to motivate her to act. He had spent years teaching her that medical knowledge came with moral obligations. Every time he had taken her on ambulance calls, he had emphasized that their skills existed to serve others, not to make themselves feel important. Sarah thought about Rodriguez and Williams, lying in hospital beds somewhere, alive because she had found the courage to speak up. She thought about their families, who would see their loved ones come home instead of receiving folded flags and military honors. But she also thought about the responsibility that would come with accepting a medical role. Every decision she made could mean the difference between life and death for someone's son, daughter, husband, or wife. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. As the night wore on, Sarah wrestled with the most difficult decision of her life. She could decline the reassignment and return to her communications duties, probably facing some loss of respect but maintaining the relative safety of her support role. Or she could accept the challenge and become the medic she had been trained to be, embracing both the rewards and risks that came with saving lives. The choice would define not only the rest of her deployment, but the kind of person she wanted to be. Sarah reported to Colonel Harrison's office at 0700 hours the next morning, having made her decision during the sleepless night. The colonel was reviewing morning reports when she knocked, and he gestured for her to sit without looking up from his paperwork. "Have you reached a decision, Martinez?" "Yes, sir. I'll accept the medical assignment." The words came out stronger than Sarah felt inside, but she was committed to the path she had chosen. Colonel Harrison finally looked up, studying her face carefully. "Are you certain? This isn't a decision you can change your mind about later. Once you take on medical responsibilities, soldiers will depend on you in ways they never depended on you as a communications specialist." "I understand, sir. It's what I should have been doing all along." "Good. Report to Doc Williams at 0800. He'll begin your transition training immediately. You'll maintain your communications duties for now, but medical training will take priority." The colonel's expression softened slightly. "Martinez, what you did yesterday took courage. Not just the medical skills, but the willingness to step forward when it mattered. That's the kind of soldier this unit needs." An hour later, Sarah found herself in the base medical facility with Doc Williams, who was explaining the differences between civilian emergency medicine and combat medicine. The facility was larger than it appeared from outside, equipped with surgical capabilities and enough supplies to handle multiple casualties. The biggest difference you'll need to understand, Doc Williams explained while showing her various medical equipment, is that we often have to make treatment decisions with incomplete information while under fire. Civilian EMTs usually have the luxury of controlled environments and backup from hospitals. Here, we might be the only medical care available for hours. Sarah nodded, absorbing every detail as Doc Williams demonstrated military-specific procedures. The CAT tourniquet, hemostatic agents for controlling bleeding, and field-expedient airway management techniques were all variations on concepts she understood but adapted for combat conditions. Your instincts yesterday were spot on, Doc Williams continued. The way you diagnosed the pneumothorax and guided Davies through treatment showed real understanding of trauma medicine. But we need to build on that foundation with military-specific training. Over the following days, Sarah split her time between communications duties and intensive medical training. Doc Williams proved to be an excellent teacher, patient with her questions but demanding in his expectations. He taught her about triage procedures, how to prioritize multiple casualties, and the psychological aspects of treating wounded soldiers. The other soldiers on base began treating Sarah differently. Where before they had barely acknowledged her existence, now they sought her out for minor medical questions and seemed genuinely interested in her background. Some asked about her father's work as a paramedic, while others wanted to know about her pre-med studies. Corporal Morrison proved to be particularly curious about her transformation. "It's like you became a completely different person overnight," he told her one evening as they sat in the dining facility. "Before, you were practically invisible. Now everyone knows who you are." "I'm the same person," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The confidence she felt when dealing with medical situations seemed to be spreading to other aspects of her personality. "I just stopped hiding." The real test of her new role came 5 days after the initial crisis. A roadside bomb exploded near a convoy returning to base, and 3 vehicles were damaged with multiple casualties. Sarah was working in the communications tent when the call came in, but this time Doc Williams immediately summoned her to the medical facility. "This is it, Martinez. Multiple trauma patients coming in, and we'll need all the help we can get. Are you ready?" Sarah's mouth went dry, but she nodded. "Yes, Doc." The medical evacuation helicopters arrived within 20 minutes, bringing 6 wounded soldiers with various injuries. Sarah found herself thrust into the controlled chaos of trauma medicine, following Doc Williams's lead as they triaged patients and provided emergency treatment. Her first patient was a soldier with shrapnel wounds to his arms and chest. Sarah's training took over as she assessed the injuries, controlled bleeding, and started an IV line while Doc Williams worked on a more critically injured patient. The soldier was conscious and frightened, and Sarah found herself naturally providing reassurance while treating his wounds. "You're going to be fine," she told him while cleaning debris from a deep laceration. "These wounds look worse than they are. We'll have you patched up and talking to your family before you know it." The soldier's tension visibly decreased as Sarah worked, her calm confidence helping to manage his anxiety. When Doc Williams checked on her progress, he nodded approvingly at her technique and bedside manner. The most challenging case was a soldier with a severe leg injury, similar to what Williams had suffered during the ambush. Sarah found herself drawing on her experience talking Lieutenant Davies through the tourniquet application. But now she was applying the treatment directly. "Martinez, take the lead on this one," Doc Williams instructed, moving to assist Specialist Murphy with another patient. "You know what to do." For a moment, Sarah felt paralyzed by the responsibility. This wasn't providing guidance over a radio. She was directly responsible for saving this soldier's life, but as she looked at the wounded man's face, her training overcame her fear. She worked methodically, controlling the bleeding, assessing for other injuries, and preparing the patient for surgical evacuation to a larger medical facility. Her movements were sure and efficient, guided by knowledge that had become instinctive through her father's training and Doc Williams's instruction. 2 hours later, all 6 patients had been stabilized and evacuated to higher levels of care. Sarah stood in the now quiet medical facility, her uniform stained with blood, but feeling a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced in communications work. Doc Williams approached her as she cleaned up the treatment area. "Outstanding work, Martinez. You handled that like a veteran medic. How do you feel?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Tired, but good. Really good, actually. I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing." "I think you're right. Colonel Harrison wants to see us both at 1600 hours to discuss making your medical assignment permanent." That afternoon, sitting in the colonel's office again, Sarah listened as Doc Williams provided his assessment of her performance. His recommendation was unqualified. She should be officially redesignated as a combat medic and receive formal certification for the skills she had demonstrated. "Martinez, based on Doc Williams's evaluation and your performance over the past week, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to specialist and official designation as a combat medic. You'll receive retroactive credit for medical training and be assigned permanently to our medical team." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "I don't think that's possible," Colonel Harrison replied. "You've already proven yourself under fire. The question now is whether you're ready to help train other soldiers in basic medical skills. Doc Williams has suggested that your teaching ability could benefit the entire unit." As Sarah left the Colonel's office, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 1 week. The quiet, anonymous communications specialist was gone, replaced by someone she was still getting to know. But for the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 3 months had passed since Sarah's dramatic transformation from anonymous communications specialist to combat medic, and forward operating base Zulu had become a different place under her influence. What started as a simple reassignment had evolved into something much more significant. Sarah had become the driving force behind a comprehensive medical training program that was changing how the entire unit approached battlefield medicine. The morning formation on December 18th was crisp and cold, with frost covering the equipment and vehicles scattered around the base. Sarah stood with the other medics as Colonel Harrison prepared to address the assembled troops. She had grown comfortable with her visibility among the soldiers, no longer the quiet mouse who tried to blend into the background. "Today marks an important milestone for our unit," Colonel Harrison announced, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air. 3 months ago, we had a crisis that revealed both our vulnerabilities and our hidden strengths. One soldier's courage to step forward when lives were at stake has since transformed our entire approach to combat medicine." Sarah felt her cheeks redden as she realized the colonel was talking about her. Around the formation, soldiers turned to look at her with expressions of respect and gratitude. Many of them had benefited from the medical training she had implemented over the past months. The colonel continued his remarks, but Sarah's mind drifted to the incredible changes that had occurred since that first emergency radio call. After officially becoming a combat medic, she had discovered a passion for teaching that surprised everyone, including herself. What began as informal conversations about basic first aid had grown into structured training sessions that every soldier on base was required to attend. Her teaching style was practical and engaging, drawing from real experiences rather than textbook scenarios. She used stories from her father's paramedic work and actual cases from their deployment to illustrate important concepts. Soldiers who had previously seen medical training as boring mandatory instruction found themselves genuinely interested in learning life-saving skills. The results had been dramatic. When a vehicle rollover occurred 6 weeks after her transition, 3 different soldiers applied tourniquets correctly before medics arrived on scene. A month later, a soldier suffering a heart attack during physical training received immediate CPR from his workout partner, who had learned the technique in one of Sarah's classes. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The confidence she had gained through medical work had transformed her entire personality. She spoke up in meetings, offered suggestions for improving base operations, and had become someone that other soldiers sought out for advice on both medical and personal matters. Doc Williams had become not just her mentor, but her closest friend on base. He often told her that she had natural teaching instincts that made her more effective at training soldiers than many instructors with years of experience. "You have a gift for making complex medical concepts understandable," he had told her. "More importantly, you make people believe they can learn these skills." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Sarah had faced 2 mass casualty events during her tenure as a medic, including a mortar attack that wounded 8 soldiers simultaneously. Each crisis had tested her skills and emotional resilience, but she had emerged stronger and more confident with each experience. Her relationship with her tent mates had evolved as well. Corporal Morrison had become fiercely protective of her reputation, often bragging to soldiers from other units about his medic. Sergeant Chen had started attending Sarah's medical classes, even though logistics specialists weren't required to participate. Private Rodriguez had confided that watching Sarah's transformation had inspired him to consider medical training. After his deployment ended, the mail call that morning brought a letter from her father that made Sarah smile. He had written about his pride in her decision to embrace her medical calling, but also about something else. He had been contacted by military medical personnel who wanted to learn about his training methods. Sarah's success had drawn attention from higher headquarters, and they were interested in incorporating civilian emergency medical experience into military training programs. Colonel Harrison concluded his remarks by calling Sarah forward to the front of the formation. "Specialist Martinez, please step forward." Sarah's heart pounded as she made her way through the ranks of soldiers. She had no idea what was happening, but the serious expressions on the faces around her suggested something significant was about to occur. "Specialist Martinez," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying across the formation. "3 months ago, you made a choice that saved 2 lives and revealed capabilities that have since benefited our entire unit. Your medical skills, teaching ability, and leadership have transformed how we approach battlefield medicine." The colonel paused, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a small black box. "By order of the commanding general, you are hereby awarded the Army Commendation Medal for meritorious service and life-saving actions during combat operations. Additionally, you are promoted to the rank of sergeant, effective immediately." Sarah stood in stunned silence as Colonel Harrison pinned the medal to her uniform and placed the new rank insignia in her hands. The formation erupted in applause and cheers from soldiers who had come to respect and admire their unlikely hero. "Furthermore," the colonel continued, "I have been authorized to inform you that upon completion of this deployment, you will be offered the opportunity to attend the Army's Advanced Medical Training Program, with full support for completing your pre-med studies. The Army recognizes exceptional talent when it sees it." As the formation was dismissed, Sarah found herself surrounded by congratulating soldiers. Doc Williams was grinning broadly as he approached her. "Well, Sergeant Martinez, how does it feel to be officially recognized for what we've known all along?" "Overwhelming," Sarah admitted, looking at the medal and rank insignia in her hands. "I never expected any of this when I made that first radio call." "That's what makes it meaningful," Doc Williams replied. "You didn't do it for recognition or advancement. You did it because it was right." That evening, Sarah sat in the communications tent where her journey had begun, writing a letter to her parents. The same radios that had carried her first desperate instructions to Lieutenant Davies now hummed quietly in the background, monitoring routine traffic from patrols operating around the base. She wrote about the medal and promotion, but more importantly, she wrote about finding her true calling. The scared young woman who had hidden her medical knowledge to avoid responsibility had been replaced by someone who embraced the opportunity to serve others. The quiet girl who had sought anonymity had become a leader who inspired others to develop life-saving skills. As she sealed the letter, Sarah reflected on the unpredictable nature of life. 6 months earlier, she had been focused on surviving her deployment without drawing attention to herself. Now she was being offered opportunities that could define the rest of her career and life. The radio crackled with a routine check-in from a patrol, and Sarah automatically noted their position and status. But she was no longer the frightened communications specialist who had monitored those transmissions with anxiety. She had become someone that those patrol members could depend on if crisis struck. Someone whose skills and courage had been tested under fire and proven reliable. Outside the tent, Forward Operating Base Zulu continued its mission in the Afghan mountains, but thanks to one soldier's decision to step forward when lives hung in the balance, it had become a place where every soldier possessed basic medical skills that could save lives. Sarah Martinez had discovered that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from charging into battle, but from accepting the responsibility to use your gifts in service of others. The quiet girl in the field tent had indeed become much more than anyone suspected. including herself.